Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty dramatic. The complete breakdown of that fragile economic truce between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, it really fell apart fast.
It did. And we're not just talking minor skirmishes anymore. People are already calling this Trade War 2.0. It feels like a full-blown confrontation.
It absolutely does.
So our mission today is really to arm you with the specifics. We need to unpack these new economic weapons being used, understand the shockwaves hitting the markets, and look at the legal challenges hanging over the whole tariff situation.
And the stakes are just incredibly high this time around. It's fundamentally different from, say, 2018.
How so?
Well, it's moved way beyond just trade deficits or IP theft arguments. Now it's all supercharged by geopolitics around AI, the race for AI dominance, and this really intense battle for critical resources.
It feels like the world's two biggest economies are really heading towards a kind of cold economic standoff.
That's exactly the fear. And we actually have a specific date when things really tipped over, October 10th, 2025.
Right, the actions that day were incredibly swift and aggressive.
Yeah.
It felt like the gloves really came off. President Trump announced plans for a, quote, massive increase in tariffs. That's a pretty clear signal.
A major escalation. And China's response was almost immediate. It was chillingly fast, really.
What did they do?
Within hours of that tariff news, Beijing slapped these new, pretty crippling port fees on essentially all U.S.-linked vessels owned, operated, or flagged. And they made them effective just 4 days later, October 14th.
Wow, that's not bureaucratic lag. That's aiming to cause immediate disruption.
Exactly. It targeted shipping, retail, logistics right away.
Okay, so let's step back. How did we get here? How did we go from that, temporary calm, the truce, to this kind of full-scale fight in just a matter of months?
Well, the trigger really was the return of that America First trade policy push early in 2025.
Yeah.
The administration kicked off what was basically a tariff blitz.
Blitz.
Yeah, they reimposed old tariffs and massively expanded them. We saw rates hitting like 145% on certain Chinese imports.
Targeted, I assume.
Very targeted. Strategic sectors, EVs, specialized steel, semiconductor components. It was clearly meant to force a kind of decoupling.
And China hit back hard, didn't they?
Yeah.
Especially targeting U.S. agriculture.
Oh, absolutely. Beijing retaliated with equivalent force, tariffs up to 125% on key U.S. goods, soybeans, obviously, but also aircraft parts, cars.
And the impact on U.S. farmers.
Immediate and severe. Soybean exports in particular just plummeted. China had to quickly pivot, start sourcing more from Brazil, Russia, even Africa.
Then we had that brief moment mid-year, that flicker of hope.
Yeah.
The false dawn, as some called it.
Right, that 90-day tariff freeze back in June. It did generate a lot of optimism. U.S. tariffs dropped to 30%. China's down to 10%.
Looked like maybe they were paving the way for that Xi-Trump summit everyone expected.
Exactly. But here's the crucial part. The real sticking points, the core strategic disagreements, they were never really addressed during that truce.
Things like rare earths and AI.
Precisely. Access to China's rare earth exports and U.S. restrictions on advanced AI tech going to China, those were just sort of swept under the rug.
So the truce was built on shaky ground.
Completely. And when Washington decided to tighten the screws further on AI, well, that's when the whole thing collapsed.
Which brings us to September, October, and that serious escalation. It went beyond just trade friction then, right? We started seeing national security lists.
That was the big shift. Washington made its move with new chip restrictions specifically targeting Chinese AI companies. Beijing reacted immediately, called it economic bullying.
And then the lists came out.
Tit for tat. The U.S. added 14 Chinese firms to its entity list, which is a big deal,
Explain that significance, the entity list.
Being on that list basically cuts those companies off from buying essential American tech software, components, machinery. It's a major blow to their high-tech operations.
And China's counter.
They hit back instantly, adding 16 U.S. companies to their own unreliable entity list. And the key thing here, many of those U.S. firms have significant defense contracts.
So it confirms the fight isn't just about economics anymore. It's strategic military tech.
Absolutely. That's what clearly marks this as Trade War 2.0. It's a battle now for control over the foundations of, well, the next industrial age.
So beyond tariffs and these entity lists, what are the new weapons in this fight? The sources talk about controlling different domains.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is this almost perfect asymmetry in their leverage. It's like one side controls the intangible, the other controls the physical.
How do you mean?
Well, the U.S. strength is in the algorithms and financial systems. Think advanced chip design, IP, software, and crucially, access to the dollar-based global financial system.
Okay. The software and finance side.
Right. China, on the other hand, their leverage is in the atoms and minerals, the actual physical hardware, the raw materials that you need to build all this modern technology.
Let's zoom in on China's side then. Rare earths. It's often called their nuclear option. Why is it so critical?
That term isn't really hyperbole. The potential disruption is massive. China supplies, what, over 70% of the global demand for rare earth elements?
That's a lot.
But the real choke point is processing. They process nearly 90% of the global supply. We're
Yeah.
talking about those 17 specific elements like dysprosium, terbium.
What are those used in?
They're absolutely essential for high-performance magnets, and those magnets are in everything.
Right.
Every EV motor, every wind turbine generator, tons of advanced defense tech. Think F-35 systems, those sophisticated ASA radars.
Okay, so dependence is huge. And the new threat weaponizes that processing power. This 0.1% rule.
Exactly. Starting December 1st, China announced this new rule. Any product, doesn't matter where it's made, if it contains more than 13.1% Chinese rare earth materials by weight, it needs specific government approval to be exported.
That sounds incredibly complex to manage.
Think about it. Almost every electronic device has trace amounts. This gives Beijing this immense power to slow down or even potentially paralyze entire global supply chains almost at will. It's a massive chokehold.
But we've been hearing for years about efforts to build alternative rare earth supply chains outside China.
Yeah.
Why is that taking so long? Why aren't there options now?
Because it's incredibly difficult and slow. Building a fully integrated chain from mining to refining, separating the elements, then actually making the high-performance magnets, it takes huge amounts of capital and time.
How much time are we talking?
Realistically, 5 to 10 years to get new large-scale projects fully operational. So right now, for most manufacturers globally, there's just no immediate plan B.
Okay, so China has the atoms. The U.S. counter-leverage then is the algorithms, semiconductors, AI tech.
Precisely. Washington is using its edge in high-end technology, primarily through export bans on the most advanced AI chips, think NVIDIA's H100, and critically, the incredibly complex machinery needed to make those advanced chips.
And they've got allies involved.
Yes, that's key. They've successfully brought allies like Japan and the Netherlands on board. Those countries control the majority of the essential, super advanced lithography and etching equipment.
So that creates this kind of stalemate we're seeing.
It does. China can make chips, yes, but they lack the absolute cutting-edge tools that the U.S. and its allies control. Meanwhile, the U.S. has the tools, but it still relies heavily on China's rare earths for the actual hardware those chips power. It's a mutual dependency weaponized.
Which brings us to the crucial question for everyone listening. What does this actually mean for the global economy, for your finances right now?
Well, the immediate shock to the markets on October 10th was pretty severe. It was brutal. Investors globally saw something like $1.65 trillion wiped off market caps.
Was that broad-based panic or focused?
Mm-hmm.
We saw the headlines about the Dow dropping over 800 points.
The Dow drop, about 1.14%, was definitely the big headline number, the psychological hit. But the deeper pain, the real anxiety, was concentrated in the tech sectors.
Intense, given the focus on chips and AI.
Exactly. The NASDAQ tumbled 2.3%. Semiconductor stocks got hammered because they're caught in the middle, needing U.S. tools, but often relying on Chinese assembly. Same for EV stocks, heavily dependent on Chinese batteries and those rare earth magnets.
Where did investors put their money? Fleeing to safety.
Yeah, the usual suspects. U.S. Treasury saw inflows. But interestingly, Bitcoin also saw a noticeable jump.
Bitcoin, why?
It suggests maybe a flight towards assets that are seen as, non-sovereign, detached from central banks, especially during periods of intense geopolitical friction like this.
And what about the cost to the average person, the consumer impact?
Well, when you boil it down, economists see these tariffs acting essentially as indirect taxes. The estimates floating around suggest that this could cost the average U.S. household somewhere between, say, $1,200 and $1,400 a year.
How? Where would we see that?
You should probably brace for price hikes, maybe 10% to 30% on things like electronics, apparel, lots of everyday household goods that rely on Chinese manufacturing or components. This conflict basically makes inflation stickier, harder to bring down no matter what central banks try to do.
We know who's losing badly here. U.S. farmers, global shipping facing those new port fees, retailers. Are there any winners? Any silver linings or sectors actually benefiting from this accelerated decoupling?
Yes, there are a couple of clear beneficiaries emerging. First, you've got domestic U.S. manufacturing. It's seeing a real boost, an amplified onshoring trend.
Driven by necessity, but also policy.
Both. There's the strategic push, but it's also being fueled significantly by federal money, specifically the CHPS Act for semiconductors and the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, promoting domestic green energy and EV production.
Okay, so domestic manufacturing gets a lift. What's the second area?
That's the acceleration of the China Plus One strategy. Companies desperately trying to diversify their production out of China.
Where are they going?
Countries like Mexico, Vietnam, India are seeing huge inflows of manufacturing investment right now. Vietnam's exports to the U.S., for example, are reportedly up something like 34% year on year already.
And this isn't just simple stuff moving.
No, it's becoming more complex. We're talking about relocating assembly for mid-level electronics, general goods manufacturing, moving it to places seen as geographically closer or, frankly, politically safer to reduce that direct exposure to the U.S.-China fight.
Okay, before we get to the wrap-up, we absolutely have to touch on this legal wildcard. The whole basis for these sweeping tariffs is actually being challenged in court, right? A Supreme Court decision could potentially change the game overnight.
This is really crucial context. The core legal fight is about which law actually gives the president the authority to impose these kinds of broad, open-ended tariffs.
What are the options being debated?
Is it the emergency powers law that's IEPA, or is it the more traditional trade laws like Section 301 or Section 232 of the Trade Act? Basically, the courts are trying to decide, is this president acting under emergency powers, or is this just standard, albeit aggressive, trade policy?
And where do things stand legally right now? What have the lower courts said?
Well, the Federal Circuit Court has already given some signals. They suggested that using IEPA, the emergency law, for these kinds of long-term, widespread trade measures is probably not authorized. But, importantly, they did uphold the existing Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods, which were imposed after specific investigations. So there's a distinction between invoking emergency powers versus using established trade procedures.
Okay, let's game this out. Scenario A. The Supreme Court strikes down the broad tariffs entirely. What happens then? Instant relief.
You definitely see a market bump, a relief rally, probably modest. Consumers might get a little bit of inflation relief in the near term, and the pace of decoupling would likely slow down. Companies might pause, reevaluate supply chain shifts.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
Oh, a huge catch. The White House would almost certainly just redo the tariffs. Same goals, same targets, just using a different legal justification, probably Section 301, which the courts seem okay with. It takes time, paperwork, bureaucracy, but the underlying protectionist policy doesn't vanish.
And
crucially, China's rare earth export controls. They wouldn't be affected at all by a U.S. court ruling. That leverage remains completely intact.
Okay, so even if the tariffs fall legally, the strategic fight and China's leverage continue. What about scenario B? The Supreme Court upholds the tariffs.
That just pours fuel on the fire. If the tariffs are deemed fully legal, inflation probably stays higher for longer. Corporate strategies harden immediately.
How so?
Companies basically lock in their plans for structural decoupling. It shifts from maybe hedging bets to a definite China or not decision. You'd see a much faster move towards a more clearly defined two-block global economy. Meaning massive, expensive efforts to build parallel supply chains, dual sourcing architectures, moving manufacturing out of China, not just for flexibility, but for permanent structural separation.
So wrapping this up, what does this fracturing really mean for you listening right now as you try to navigate this? It sounds like confirmation the world is splitting.
It really does feel that way, splitting into these two distinct economic spheres. You could almost call it the Western cloud, dominating the intangible stuff like AI models, finance, high-end chip design versus the Eastern grid, anchored by minerals, hardware manufacturing, physical infrastructure.
A digital versus industrial duel.
That's a good way to put it. This digital industrial duel has far higher stakes than what we saw back in 2018. We're talking about the stability of AI supply chains, the entire global transition to EVs, maybe even the future of the dollar-based trade system. It all feels like it's in play.
So we're shifting away from that era of kind of seamless globalization.
Definitely. Moving rapidly towards strategic fragmentation.
Yeah.
Both sides are digging in, prioritizing national resilience, strategic self-reliance, often over pure economic efficiency.
The next few weeks, maybe months, feel critical then. Will this turn out to be strategic brinkmanship? Or is it really an irreversible breakdown setting the stage for the next decade?
That's the key question. All the signs point to both sides doubling down on self-reliance right now.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe something provocative for you to consider. If this crisis genuinely forces the US, Europe, Japan to accelerate and succeed in diversifying their critical supply chains, especially things like rare earth processing, advanced magnets, could the short-term pain we're feeling now, the volatility, the inflation, actually lead to a more resilient, maybe strategically healthier global economy by, say, 2030?
It's a fascinating long-term question. Is there a path through this disruption to a more stable, if more fragmented, future? That's what we'll be watching closely.